Morning, everyone. Welcome to the weekly IAB webinar. For those who don't know me, my name is Gai Leroy and I'm lucky enough to be the CEO of the IAB in Australia. We've got a fun one today and I've even put some lipstick on because we've got the wonderful, in the mix of our guests, Lyndall from L'Oreal joining us. So I thought I'd better spruce myself up a little bit. For those who haven't joined us before, this webinar will go for an hour. Please pop in any questions you've got into the Q&A box and we'll try and get through to them at the end of the session. But feel free to drop through comments and questions. Keep it clean, but love to hear from you and what you'd like to know from the guests. Format today, so I'll do a little bit of a kick-off and set the scene, some traffic trends, some trends that we're seeing in market, and then the real expert on trends is going to join us from an e-commerce point of view. So Rose Yip from Australia Post has some wonderful research that they do quite regularly, as well as some insights on some recent trends, parcels, state-by-state delivery. She's at the forefront of crunching the data in terms of what's actually happening, deliveries around Australia and different sort of channel management. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with a few guests, so Rose will join us for that as well. And then we've got Gracie, who's the CMO of Catch, which is a marketplace, for those who don't know it, that has been acquired by Wesfarmers in the recent past, so part of a bigger family that started as a sort of a wily startup. So it'd be interesting to hear from him what he's seeing now. We've got Erik Hallander, who's the CEO of Isobar in Australia and New Zealand. So an agency very much specialised on the consumer experience and sort of tech integration side, who'll help us. And the wonderful Lyndall Campher, who's with L'Oreal, looks after their media, really amazing brand manager who has a whole lot of, as you know, under the L'Oreal sort of family, a lot of different brands with different audiences, and we can get a bit of an understanding of how they're sort of transforming. I hate to use that cliched word, but as we're moving into the sort of the e-commerce and online retail space. I think I've been in the digital space for way too long, but since sort of the late 90s. And e-commerce has sort of had a bumpy history in the Australian market, but we've seen some interesting innovation, but definitely the last 6 months we've seen some pretty big changes. So a few slides from me. So that's our wonderful lineup. In terms of traffic going to e-commerce and retail sites at the moment, so in July this year we had 18 million Australians visiting retail sites, either on their PC, smartphone or tablets. You can see a bit of a breakdown, really mass sort of adoption across all those different sort of subcategories in the area. So big chunk of people who at least visited, whether they've transacted or been looking for information, using apps, etc. So a whole lot of different activity going on there. In terms of time, so April was definitely a national peak there. So we saw time overall for retail sites up 44%. You can see a little bit of a dip in June when we started to go back into the world, and then July, as Melbourne sort of locked down again, we've seen a big jump there again as well. So it's interesting to look at that sort of state by state cut as well, but incredible uplift. And we'll have a chat a bit later around what we imagine will stick around and what will go back to previous levels. If we sort of go within the sites and the sub areas again of what's really been taking off, and we've seen quite a lot of coverage in market in this. I was surprised, maybe this is just too telling about me, that alcohol wasn't higher there, but we've seen home and garden, renovation side of things, a lot of work from Bunnings, a whole lot of different areas really take off. And a category that was already going pretty heavily, but really big jump in terms of the fresh meal kits as well. A lot of people trialling them during this period, and again, it'll be interesting to see how that trial transfers into sort of long-term habits. And then those sort of the takeaway delivery aggregator apps, again, sort of an industry that the last year or two has seen a lot of trial and adoption, really picking up there in terms of time spent. Earlier in the year, we released a report looking at the direct brands market, so the direct-to-consumer side of things, with a research company called Pollinates. Hopefully some of you saw that. I will share the link to that report and press release. But it's a market that we've been watching through the IAB, particularly in the States. They've been looking at the direct-to-consumer market probably for 3 or 4 years now. And the growth of these smaller brands and sort of traction with consumers. So if you haven't had a look at that report, that list on the that we've got there isn't all the brands. These are some that we tested in terms of awareness in market. So don't be offended if your brand's not there. We did just test for a few different things. It's a really interesting report. There's definitely been momentum in the Australian market, but if I compare it to the reports that the US and UK have done in the same space, it's definitely smaller. And this was research done in the beginning of the year, so before lockdown. So it'd be interesting to replicate that in market later in the year. But definitely lots of interesting brands, but definitely not that sort of mass adoption that we're seeing in the US and UK. But I'm sure we'll hear more from our panelists on different brands that are doing it well. Some of the areas that we sort of interrogated in terms of why those who do use those sort of direct-to-consumer brands, e-commerce sort of, and often sort of brands that have grown through the social side of things, why they use them. And you can see the different attributes there that really shine through for sort of these smaller brands compared to sort of the broader mass areas. Doesn't mean that some of those other larger brands don't have that as well, but it's definitely something that's been, I guess, at the forefront of their marketing in terms of their role and reason to exist in market. A few qualities that, again, were coming through, and this isn't necessarily unique to direct brands, but we were asking around why consumers did trial and then adopt and stay loyal to particular brands. And even though we saw those sort of purpose-driven areas coming through really strongly for direct brands, you know, the top drivers, you know, are sort of generic ones that apply to all businesses, the value for money and the sort of delivery and returns, things that, you know, everyone needs to deliver well on. And then you can see those sort of stronger purpose-driven things still being important, but really any brand having to meet those sort of top hygiene levels to really get a foot in the door. And then the others in terms of differentiators and things that can really make people loyal and feel like they're part of, I guess, a brand family. If that's not over egging a relationship that people have with brands, it'll depend on the category, depending on how close they feel to those different categories. So that's just a bit of info in terms of the direct brands market. Rose will talk to the growth in market, but just some of the recent release data from NAB that track the online sales. Very easy chart to read. See the huge growth since sort of earlier in the year in terms of online sales. We'll put a link up to more detail there, but be interesting to see again how that tracks. Why is the IAB talking about this? Well, apart from, I guess, it being really important from an overall marketing point of view, in the online ad revenue report that we released a few weeks ago, so we track online ad revenue each quarter along with our friends at PwC and the investment going towards different media properties. And for the first time in over 10 years, the auto category was not the #1 investment category for content sites in Australia. Retail actually took over that space. So huge amount of investment, both from a brand messaging point of view and a performance side of things in the retail sector. So incredibly important changes and understanding of audience needed for anyone in the marketing and ad space, whether you be a publisher, agency or marketer. But that's the biggest shift in categories that I've seen within a quarter since looking at ad revenue in the digital space since about '98. So huge huge shift in that sort of investment area. We are hoping that auto picks up, so we don't necessarily want that to see that drop in share for all categories, but definitely retail's having an interesting time. And as we talk to marketers around making sure they're staying alive, their share of voice in our investment is more important than ever, as we're seeing this increasing activity. Making sure your brand sort of front and centre in consumers' mind is going to be incredibly important, not only for short-term but long-term brand growth. So it's just a few bits and pieces from us. Rose is going to take over now and share some information that they've pulled together and what she's seeing in market. Rose, if you want to kick me off and take over. And everyone, please feel free to throw through questions.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself too. Seems to be a trend these days. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's it. Perfect.
Make sure okay. Fantastic. So thanks, Guy. Thanks for having us here today. So I'm probably just going to go through very briefly in terms of just looking at 2019. Just one slide on it in terms of where we landed last year. So very solid growth, and we were tracking pretty well, certainly from an online e-commerce space. We measure a couple of things. So probably the biggest things we measure is looking around the dollar spent in the online world, and also what the online goods spend is tracking at the moment. So the biggest for us, we noticed over trend, and certainly what Guy has talked about before is retail as a whole has been trending around about the high 2% year-on-year growth. It's been pretty consistent over the number of years. And the biggest thing we looked at here is we take out things like cafes and restaurants, because they're kind of not comparable to what we look at from an online goods point of view. So we take that out of the equation, and even with that, the trending has been sitting around the high 2% year-on-year growth. But what's really interesting is just looking at the online goods market. So we track this probably looking at similar data to NAB, but this data is more sliced to just looking at physical goods. So we take out anything to looking at digital services and so forth. At the end of last year, growing really, really strong at 17.5% year-on-year. But what was really great was we landed at the share of 11.3%, which is a solid, good share. We expected it to come that way, and we certainly are in a good position moving forward with that. Probably the biggest trend we saw last year was the adoption into things like Black Friday and Cyber Monday, being very much American type sales event. In Australia, we started to adopt that even more clearly now. We're seeing lots of growth in that space. Other categories that were really, really strong, and we tend to see that in the online space, are things like purchasing for variety stores, and variety stores being things like marketplaces like Catch and department stores and so forth. So they tend to be like the types of products that consumers buy online quite a lot, from variety stores. And fashion, absolutely fashion. Fashion was like 1 in 3 parcels that we deliver are kind of related to fashion products. And more so we're seeing, even in 2019, home and garden is one of the popular categories that's been trending quite a bit. The biggest things we notice and we tend to see in terms of demographics and suburbs and people that are buying online tend to be areas that are a little bit more slightly regional or more towards newer housing. So things like Toowoomba, Cranbourne and Point Cook tend to be the ones top buying suburbs, and they've been trending pretty strong last year. Now moving on to 2020. Now obviously everything's pretty much turned on its head now. So if we look at the graph, and that's very similar to the graph that guys just showed, and I just wanted to show the jaws that we see there, and in terms of online goods spend compared to retail sales. Certainly April has been a very defining month, and certainly a record month that we've broken all records to date. Having said that, though, August is looking very likely to be pretty high as well. I haven't got August figures yet, but that's looking pretty strong. Just looking at the parcel trend at the moment. Certainly, when we look at the retail sales, excluding cafes and restaurants, we are trending at 16% year-on-year growth. Certainly by the end of July, that's what we're looking at. And online goods spend are sitting at a high of 66% year-on-year growth. Now, from a parcel perspective, what we can see and what we notice is one of the biggest trends are certainly in the defining period in April. We're seeing a lot of regular shoppers that are shopping very often. So they've increased their frequency during that time. And also more importantly, what we notice is that we're seeing new households that are shopping online. So around about 200,000 new residential addresses were being captured during that period. And what was really interesting as we measured that, some of these behaviors we're talking about, how much of this is actually going to stick moving forward, these shoppers are really shopping much more frequently than we would typically see a new shopper would actually do. So certainly some interesting things that are happening in that new shopper angle. As we deep dive in further into some of the demographics of these new shoppers, we are seeing a skew towards coastal and regional towns that are coming up, which, you know, it's probably not surprising given everyone's kind of in lockdown period, and certainly in April. So skew towards those areas, and the demographics are essentially being more mature audiences, and also, you know, more families with you know, kids and so forth. So they could be going to their holiday homes potentially as people started to work from home. So not surprising there in some of those trends, but certainly very interesting for businesses and marketers alike, and having all these new shoppers online, and how do we keep them more engaged moving forward, and see whether this behavior will stick. Now, as we look through the rest of most of this year, what I have here is just a trend graph, and going as far back as I want to capture Black Friday, because Black Friday was probably the defining benchmark that we're looking for. That's the week where we noticed most of the online purchases, and this is measuring what we can see around the number of online purchases going through our network. So the biggest things you can see there, the numbers on the graphs are actually showing how the volume or the online purchase were ranked during those weeks. You notice very quickly, Black Friday, which was initially our busiest period, is now ranked number 2. And the more recent weeks in August, we're seeing a lot more online shopping during this time. So we've been seeing rankings of 1, 2, and 3 very much clustered in the last few weeks. This is also much, much higher, and I just need to point out, than the April period. So if you look at April, where we have, when the pandemic was first declared, the graph was starting to rise during that time, and the number of online purchases started to increase as restrictions started to come in play. We're seeing more and more online purchases coming through. But what was really interesting is we thought most of this would start to taper off, and it did for a little while, and probably around May, June, a little bit. But certainly since Victoria has gone into the second wave, the number of online purchases has started to increase much higher again. So to date, when we measure the year-on-year growth since the pandemic was declared, the growth in online purchases is sitting above 73% year-on-year. So that's a massive number, and you know, we saw in 2019 we're talking about growth of 70% was really good, but now we're talking numbers that are way beyond 50, 60s, and 70% mark that we're looking at. Now, what's interesting is what are consumers actually buying during this time? So what we have here, looking at the same time series, but measuring it from a year-on-year perspective and across a few different categories. And you realize very quickly, since at the beginning of the pandemic, there's different waves or different sequence or stages of buying behavior that start to appear in the data, very much so. There's actually quite a number of stages. If you think about the initial time very much earlier on in March, and I remember I was out in the pub with a friend of mine because he's finishing off work, and the following week we were all stay at home. So it's very, very clear. During that very time of that initial panic buying stages, we're seeing food and liquor was one of the first categories that actually jumped up really quickly. And that's that purple line. I do apologize, there are lots of colors on the screen, but that's the kind of that first purple line that popped up really quickly within the initial panic buying stages. But what was really interestingly that came afterwards was as people start to realize they have to work from home, we're noticing things like more home products are actually more coming online, variety stores into office supplies, meaning you set your home up to work from home. And that progressed to homeschooling. So when you start homeschooling, you need to entertain your children. So puzzles and games became one of the things that were popular during that time. And then it progressed to the next stage, you know, when you start to realize I'm going to be working from home for quite some time. I need to entertain myself. There's nothing much to do in the weekend. So home and garden become much of a category, which is that green line you see. And that green line, I just want to point out, has been sustained pretty high throughout the pandemic. And this is, you know, very much so since we've been in restricted movement for quite some time now. So that's the category that's been trending very, very high. What's really interesting that we notice right now as well is around health and beauty, and certainly the beauty category has popped up quite a bit. And Lyndall might want to chime in and tell us why that might be the case. Lyndall and Ryan, some of the beauty products are popping up in some of the high trending categories as well. The ones that are probably lagging a bit behind has been a little bit more around fashion and books. And fashion, I think a lot of it's been shifting towards more casual wear. And I say lagging a bit behind. If you look at the graph, that's still sitting above like 40-50% year-on-year growth. So that's where we are right now. The growth that we're talking about, even though it might not seem as big, is actually sitting at a much higher mark than ever before. The greatest thing we notice right now with Victoria being into stage 4, this graph probably says it all, year-on-year growth and something measuring it from a monthly perspective. In the last couple of months, Victoria growth has certainly well exceeded anyone's expectation. The biggest thing with that growth as well, and we noticed this for the very, very first time, Victoria as a whole is now leading the country in terms of the number of online purchases. So 38% of all the purchases are coming from Victoria, well ahead of New South Wales. Now, I think Ryan had a question before, what's happening to the other states, and we had a chat earlier on around what's happening to the other states that are not going through similar restrictions. If you look at the graphs, they're trending at the bottom, New South Wales, and I've highlighted New South Wales as the one there. They're trending around 60%, between 60 and 40% is kind of what we're looking at. Even WA is still trending very high in the last couple of months. So the idea of normalization moving forward is going to look a little bit different, given we're kind of in a state of flux for quite some time. So potentially some of these trends are likely to possibly stay as high as these 40-50% levels moving forward until there's a better solution with all the restrictions that we have right now. Now, when we look at the top 10 suburbs, so what was really interesting, so we're trying to figure out the best way to measure this because there's so much movement in the data at the moment. What we've done is just taken the top 10 suburbs in August. So what were the highest volume of online purchases? And the first thing we noticed straight away, if you look at the month of August, is this is the ranking on the far right. These suburbs actually practically almost all of them, except for one in Liverpool, they're all coming from Victoria. So not surprisingly, given we're in lockdown and online is pretty much our only option at the moment, short of click and collect if you can get outside, stay within your 5K radius. If you map some of these suburbs back into historically where they sit in terms of ranking in the previous months, you notice very quickly, even as we go far back into the early stages of the pandemic in March, some of these suburbs weren't purchasing as much then, but they are so now. So certainly we started to talk about some of these potential habits and what what triggers these triggers are going to retain over time will affect how these suburbs will perform as well moving forward. So my last slide here is we run monthly surveys asking our customers or online shoppers in terms of some of the things that are going on right now. And one of the survey we ran in July was trying to understand is there a sense of local buy Australian type of thing happening during this time of the pandemic. And what we found is that through the survey, about a third of all shoppers reported they want purchasing less from overseas compared to last year. And some of the reasons why they were actually doing so, they're talking about things like trying to support local businesses and certainly more aware of what's happening in the Australian economy at the moment. So that's one of the themes that we're noticing right now in terms of community support and more local awareness of what's happening in this space. So just to summarize, essentially new behaviors are being formed right now, and certainly some of them potentially might stick, and certainly if some of these triggers are going to remain, there's a question how much is this actually going to stick moving forward. And Guy, let's see what's going to happen from here, and then I'll probably put it to the panel and some discussion around how much of this is going to stick and how far Australians are going to continue shopping online moving forward.
Thanks so much, Rose. I'll be very interested to hear what everyone's got to say. All right, let's get into it. That was, you know, my background's in social research. I love that stuff. I could listen to Rose all day talk about the different behaviours there. I'm going to ask you guys a question that's probably going to be hard to summarise in the time that we've got. But thinking about your businesses over the last 4 to 5 months, what have been the biggest changes that you've had to make, the biggest challenges? If you want to give the audience a little bit of a summary of the pain and pleasure that the businesses have gone through over the last 6 months. Lyndall, do you want to kick off with you?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to query something in Rose's charts, if I may.
Yeah.
I saw that the suburb that I live in isn't on top of your suburb from Melbourne. And I have to tell you, I have something arriving here every single day. So I don't know, Rose. I think I'm querying your numbers there because I honestly have a lot going on.
I'll get the guys to check.
We actually, it's really been a most interesting period because with the changes, with, you know, the whole COVID arriving as it did, our business pivoted quite dramatically. Now, we have at L'Oreal 4 different divisions, right? I'll just talk about 2 of them. The one is our Luxe division, and that has products like Yves Saint Laurent, Giorgio Armani, Lancôme, Urban Decay, etc., etc. And with our Luxe division, because we have our own e-commerce or D2C websites, we immediately just pivoted everything. We stopped brand advertising and we pivoted everything into social e-commerce. And that's had remarkable results. Now with our mass market division, which we affectionately call CPD, right? But it's mass market products, Maybelline, Garnier, L'Oreal Paris as examples, where we don't have access to D2C. What we found, which was really interesting, was that some of our categories went really up in terms of usage, and some categories came really down. Now, no prizes for guessing, actually, that the category that went down the most was makeup, because nobody turns their video cameras on, apart from today, and so they're not wearing makeup, right? And not buying fashion clothing, as you saw with Rose's figures. But the areas that really went up were skincare, facial skincare, which included moisturizers and of course masks, but not the medical masks, the masks to kind of look after your skin. The other area that went up was because so many women go to nail bars, right? And so our nail polish has really taken off quite dramatically. And the other area was, you know, with all the sanitizing and washing your hands for 2 minutes, every couple of minutes, was that hand cream. We actually couldn't keep up with demand with one of our brands called CeraVe. We couldn't keep up with the demands. But really, it was a huge pivot. The whole business kind of just went overnight, literally overnight.
Thank you so much. We'll come back and talk about how you sort of brought that to life in a minute. Erik, how about you guys? How did your clients, how did you have to sort of rally around and help your clients with these changes?
Look, I think it was a really interesting period when the first wave of lockdown happened, because it all of a sudden meant that a lot of brands that maybe previously hadn't considered elements like click and collect or having to manage things like contact tracing now all of a sudden needed to do that. So I think the first period of time for us was to make sure that we had a really robust IP and product generated to be able to roll out click and collect in particular, but also contact tracing solutions, in particular around retail. So that was the first wave. Let's call it the panic almost. The second, more long-term change is probably had been more around taking a long, hard look at digital infrastructure as a whole. And I think investment is difficult. Investment is particularly difficult when you're in lockdown and a recession. But I think what has happened over the last 6 months has highlighted to most of the brands that we work with is that a robust digital infrastructure is going to be required over the next couple of years. And COVID and the lockdown that came with COVID made it impossible to look away from that. So those are probably the two biggest changes for us.
Great, thank you. How about you, Ryan? Guys must be crazy.
Yeah, it's been crazy for the past 5 months now. And I think whilst we were taking 20,000 to 25,000 orders per day, it all of a sudden doubled overnight, which put a real strain on the buyers. So the buyers had to, I'll use the word pivot, which will get used a lot, had to pivot very quickly to fit the demand. So as we all know, that the craziness that ensued in the supermarkets really then translated to online as people search for the products they couldn't find in the supermarkets, all the regulars, pasta, toilet paper, all the consumables. So what we saw was that people were just migrating to online to buy the essential items. And the buyers did a really good job to do that very, very quickly. The suppliers quickly run out of product, but they sort of scoured the world to make that happen. And also just to notice the different buying habits over the past 4 or 5 months across different states, where we look at the Western states at the moment who have resumed to a somewhat normal pattern of life. As we see through all of those charts that Rose was showing us, Victoria really overcapitalises and over-indexes on online shopping at the moment. So the interesting point there is the conversion rate that you see coming from different traffic from different states. The people in Perth have a much lower conversion rate than the people in Victoria, which is more than double the other states, because it's a necessity to be shopping online. And then the other biggest issue we had, of course, is the warehouse, where it was paramount to ensure that the safety of the workers, for starters, it's always at the forefront, but then just to keep up with that demand very, very quickly amongst government restrictions, that they made us cut down the workforce by 33%, yet the demand had gone up by triple figures. So very, very hard to get that balance right and just make sure that we're reaching demand there for our customers, and AusPost being able to reach it as well. So they have really, really struggled at the moment, and Rose will know that well. They're doing their best, they're doing everything they can, but there are only so many crates they have, only so many trucks they have, and only so many delivery drivers. So real change.
And I guess for you as a CMO, you would have had to really do the whole 4 Ps rather than just the promotion side of things. I guess the CMO role looks very different when you're, haven't got the luxury of time to develop lovely campaigns and creative.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. So we were smack bang in the middle of a pitching process for a lovely campaign, which we've now launched, and we did it amidst the pandemic remotely. So what happened there was we had to change all of the channels we were buying. Obviously, we couldn't buy outdoor anymore from Melbourne. All of that got scrapped. There's no one on the road. So radio buy had changed across various states. So it just ebbs and flows, and we look at it week by week where we can actually buy media. But we had to change our message as well. We had to be a little bit more empathetic at the start, not so much of the sell and the sizzle, but more about the we'll be there for you type message. We sort of toned that down now, as I think there's a bit of fatigue in the market around it. But yeah, it's certainly changed the way that we market.
Well, this panel, if anyone understands the pain, I know you're all in Melbourne, so definitely empathetic to what's going on.
You can tell by the head.
You should have dyed it for Lyndall.
Yeah, show you how to do it.
Lyndall, in terms of, you know, your normal, so you've talked about the business change in terms of getting messages to consumers, using different channels. You said you sort of turned off some of the brand side of things. How are you now developing creative that suits that myriad of brands that are all at different stages of e-commerce adoption?
You're quite right, because a lot of our creative assets or content comes from overseas, and we have different. They work differently in different divisions. So if I talk about our Luxe division, we get everything from what we call the DMI, Department of Marketing International, which we get from them. And with some of our Luxe brands, there's not much we can change. For example, Giorgio Armani is particularly difficult to move anything, right, or to change anything. But with Lancôme and Kiehl's, for example, we are able to do and change things quite a lot. So we basically took the assets that came in from global, which were mainly brand awareness ads, and changed them very quickly into call to action. And we learned with test and learn. Now, L'Oreal's always had a strong heritage of test and learn. You know, you've got to test and learn. If it doesn't work, doesn't matter, write it down to experience, try the next thing. And there were a couple of things that we found really worked for us. For example, you know, there's a huge uptake in video. Well, in fact, video doesn't perform that well in e-commerce for our Luxe brands. As an example, we found we get much better ROAS, or return on advertising spend, from static. And then we learned how to craft the wording and to make sure the product was hero, and how to do hit when all those sort of things we kind of learned overnight. We've also gone into testing with Facebook, and I have to give a shout out here to Facebook, because I think they really have been at the forefront of e-commerce change. You know, they've launched quite a few things. I think it's Instagram Shops, which hasn't come here yet, but there are a number of other options that we've worked really closely with Facebook in order to, and together with one of the online pure players, Adore Beauty. So we've worked really closely with Facebook. We're also doing conversational commerce as well, which we're starting to do, again, with Facebook helping us an awful lot. But we've also learned what appeals to customers. Like, one of the things which I thought was really quite interesting was that people really responded and reacted to engraving on a fragrance bottle. So you could engrave, you know, someone's name, and that really worked well on fragrance, which traditionally is not a great e-commerce product. It's more the makeup and the skincare rather than the fragrance. So that was really interesting that did. So we're just trialing all these different things. Now, when it comes to our mass market division, we had something which is most unusual for L'Oreal, because we have, particularly for our mass market division, very crafted ads. And the next thing, we got these amazing assets from Eva Longoria, who had at home videoed herself, right, using hair color and, you know, coloring her hair. And we managed to get those assets onto digital channels like within 48 hours. It was fantastic. I mean, even I'm coloring my hair at home, I have to tell you. And this is the first time in my entire life that I'm home hair coloring. But,
I love that ad, by the way. Lyndall, I love that ad. That's a great ad from L'Oreal.
It's fabulous. And the fact
it is very good. And it's so authentic as well.
Yeah, and it was just so of the moment. Do you know what I mean? Which we just thought was absolutely fantastic. Yeah, so I guess those are the ways. We're also testing e-commerce with Snapchat now. Just so we're trialing everything that we possibly can, and then we go through the process and see what works, what doesn't, put it into sort of like a bank of learnings and roll it out to the rest of the businesses.
That's great. You'll get some great case studies because, you know, talking about brands that, you know, their brand owners are quite strict in terms of, you know, the Giorgio Armani's, like what comes out of it in that long-term brand growth. It'd be fascinating to see the comparisons between your brands. Erik, you're the chap who has to help bring this all to life. So when the Lyndalls of this world want e-commerce sites launched yesterday, they want to understand customer flow. We had a good question coming through from a good friend of the IOB, Tim Martin, about use of data, you know, whether it be first party, second or third party data, and how you can really leverage it at this time. I guess you've talked a bit about how your business has had to sort of rally around, but from a really technical transformation point of view, what are the learnings that you've had over this period?
Yeah, look, I think it's a fair thing to state that brands that had recently put a bit of money and investment behind their ecosystem have had a happier journey through COVID. I think that's fair. Not to say that there hasn't been some excellent thinking on the feet from brands that have needed it. But I think, like I sort of alluded to before, what we have found and what was really highlighted during COVID is that when you need to really think on your feet and implement a lot of change, like Lyndall spoke of before, that can be very challenging if what you're looking at in sort of the systems part of your business is spaghetti and outdated and complicated. So I think the first thing for us has been, it's been a very, very big contrast of businesses that had previously invested pre-COVID into their ecosystem and how they were able to think on their feet and be more agile and roll out solutions without it being a big challenge. In contrast, though, in saying that, I think what we've seen as well is some really incredible ingenuity from businesses that have had to think on their feet, that haven't had the capital or the investment or the systems in place to get stuff done. And I think we should all be celebrating those brands, and I won't name any names to make anyone embarrassed.
Oh, go on.
We should all be celebrating those that have been able to think on their feet, and our role has really been to help guide the process. The other thing which I just like to touch on as well, because Lyndall spoke of it, one thing that we have found an absolute renewed desire from the industry is to think more broadly about experimentation, to make sure that we measure and implement change over time. Especially now during COVID, I think experimentation strategy in e-com has been crucial to make sure that we respond to how people buy and how they want to buy, make sure that we test and learn. And I'm actually, in that sense, quite grateful in a very dark way that this process and this journey has really highlighted the need and the value that can be created from a good experimentation strategy. And so, from our point of view, this has been a wild ride because everything has been quite urgent. But at the same time, I think it's been a really awesome thing to watch as brands have rallied behind the world is different. We need to act on this really quickly. We have our context, you know, our systems are what they are. Let's get it done. And from that perspective, I'm actually quite inspired by everyone that we have worked with and their ability to just get stuff done. So it's in that sense, it's actually been really positive. I am in Melbourne though, so there are some negatives as well, but I'm not going to go into them now.
Yeah, no, it's definitely digital transformation has happened. You know, someone was saying to me, you know, we've been talking about it for the last 10 years and then we just got it done in 6 months. So
pretty much, yeah.
Rose, hopefully a really quick question for you. Someone sent through a question and I'm imagining the answer. The data that you showed, that was Australia Post specific rather than the broader delivery ecosystem. Is that right? Which I'm sure you're a big part of.
The bulk of it, yes, is Australia Post deliveries, and we section the data so that we try to look at what are business to consumer driven activity from that space. The online spend is coming from net credit card data, so that's just measuring the spend which is coming through from what consumers are doing there. We haven't scaled the data up because one of the things with Australia Post data, the market share, we're probably sitting around in the highs, 70s and 80s at the moment. So it's a pretty, we think it's a pretty good representation of the market. If anything, it's probably a little bit understated given all the things that are going on right now. A lot of retailers themselves are doing some of their own deliveries with click and collect options and so forth. So potentially the growth is much, much higher than what we're seeing.
No, and the good thing about Australia Post data too is you get a good regional representation and not just those metro skews, which often you see in other data sets. Again, another question from the audience, and guys, please keep these coming through. The role of search. So, Linda, you've talked a lot about social. Ryan, I'm sure you're gathering new customers in different verticals. Has that stayed the same, increased? What's changed? Ryan, do you want to start with that one?
So look, search is it's our number one channel in terms of customer acquisition, customer retention, and also it's where most shoppers are starting their online shopping journey. They're starting with a Google search. So we will spend more than $2 million a month on Google search. So it's about 30 to 35% of our traffic, which is obviously a huge component, and we've seen the demand increase. Now the balance there is being able to keep up with that demand at a ROAS that is profitable for the business. So, and what we've seen is that over the fluctuating periods of lockdown, is that ROAS goes up and down very, very quickly and sharply. So it's just trying to maintain that balance.
Is that because you're seeing new competitors come in to the market?
It's all driven by conversion rate, really. So as people either come as a tire kicker with some impulse rather than intent, conversion rate is lower. And as I mentioned earlier, Victoria has a higher ROAS than Western Australia purely because of that conversion rate. They come in and they have to buy.
And how about you, Lyndall? How are you finding search performing at the moment?
Search performs really well for our Luxe brands because we can drive directly to our websites, our e-com websites. And what we do is we have a pool of money, and depending on how the ROAS or the CPA is going, we switch money from whichever medium to the other medium, which is working best. So, for example, we also include programmatic display, but we've actually found that for Giorgio Armani and Yves Saint Laurent, it doesn't really work for us, programmatic display. So we'll take money out of there and up the ante on search. So we play around with whatever we've got available in terms of what's driving the sale or the conversion, to Ryan's point.
We find the same thing. We try and get programmatic display to return anywhere near what we would get from Facebook or even affiliates. The problem with some of those other channels is that they're unable to scale to the level we need them to scale.
Yeah, you're quite right. We find the same. Yeah,
that's the challenge.
How are you? I guess, Erik, as well with your clients, because we've talked a lot about, I guess, short-term return here. How are you, I guess, maintaining that brand investment and that future? So you're in mad acquisition mode at the moment, but making sure that brand investment is still staying strong.
It's an infuriatingly difficult balance right now, I think. No matter what industry you're in, how much is spent on the brand versus how much is spent on more short term, make sure the pipeline is full. I feel like, unfortunately, and this is a terribly uninspiring answer, that the answer is a two-speed economy, I think. But there is a need right now for very short-term measures, very much focus on maybe not so much the brand awareness, but tactics to drive audience right now. But in the same time, I feel like the brands that we work with that do it the best have found a good balance of investing in the long-term brand as well. Because while we know that behaviors will change permanently, and I'm sure we'll get to a conversation about that, there is no doubt that we need to think long-term as well. And long-term from a brand equity point of view, long-term from a systems point of view, and the fear, I suppose, of a lot of different verticals right now is if we lose track of that too much, we're going to be faced with a complicated situation in a few months' time as behaviors return to, let's call it, closer to normality, but still different. But we've been a really strong advocate for that in terms of making sure not only that You know, when you roll out things that you just want to try and learn and test, and things that you have to roll out for necessity, it's easy to lose track of the fact that the brand still needs to be the hero. Like the experience still needs to feel like the brand. It needs to be able to breathe that brand. And if an experience can be copy pasted across two different brands with one different brand promise, then something has gone wrong. And so I feel like the work done to be able to push that back into the thinking a little bit, the brand needs to be the hero. And yes, there is a short-termism that is required, but the experiences that we create and the work that we do right now has to be in line with the brand promise and what the vision of that brand is probably how I would answer that.
Yeah, I was sort of jumping in for the defense of some of that programmatic display side of things. So there's definitely the work that we've done, you know, that long term, it does add to that brand, you know, that constant brand reminder, even if it's not driving an immediate sale. Okay, let's crystal gaze. Let's put our bets in. We'll have a book running. Rose, you've showed us some data, I guess, where the states that are opened up are sort of, you know, dropping off that peak, but still staying pretty high, sort of 50% up on previous periods. Do you still feel this is Rose? I'll have a disclaimer that Australia Post cannot be held accountable for your comments. Do you feel it'll still correct a little bit more? Or are we sitting around where you think they'll stay, say, in states like WA?
Yeah, it's a tough one. There's so many other factors at the moment. My analyst hat, in my opinion, I think we'll probably sit pretty much high in the 40s for quite some time. Given the triggers are still kind of lurking in the environment at the moment, and it's still going to be around for quite some time. I still think it's going to be probably sitting around the 40s, so probably not as high as what Victoria's going through right now, because obviously Victoria will come back to the normalization stage. Probably sitting around the 40s is my best guess at the moment.
And I guess there's a couple of other factors there. There's Australia was already behind in terms of, you know, that sort of behaviour, and presumably a lot of companies have now got their acts together, thanks to Erik and his team, but have a better consumer experience, so it makes it sort of easier and less friction to actually trade that way.
Yeah, that would be good to see. I mean, certainly in April, with that online share going up to 19%, and we never expected that for the country for 3-4 years, all packed into 1 month. So it will be interesting to see. Absolutely.
Ryan, with the changes you've seen, are there different categories that you're now interested in trying, or that you know, like what do you think will be different for you guys 12 months down the track in terms of your mix of delivery and products in market?
So there isn't a category that we haven't tried or don't try. So
okay.
We have millions of products on the site that we'll find something that's not there really. So the mix will change, and that will be driven by customer demand. And because we are a marketplace, then we're able to amp that up at any time because we really have that long tail. But in terms of the navel gazing, and talking specifically about catch and going back to what Erik was talking about earlier in regards to brand, it's been the perfect storm for us to go hard on brand. And we're going harder now than we've ever gone. Our marketing mix has gone from 95% performance and 5% brand to now about a 70-30 mix. So there's a significant investment and being driven by Wesfarmers to grow catch and to make it famous. And now is that opportune time to make it happen. So I predict that catch will continue to grow at a rate well above traditional online, as it has been for many, many years. And we need that to happen either way. So this time next year, I assume that our rate of growth will come down, given once the states level out, but it will still be significantly higher than what it was pre-COVID.
Lyndall, what do you think will look different in 12 months from all this experimentation and change? And
well, you know, it's interesting, and I've read some interesting articles in the USA, and Lord and Taylor are shutting, you know, they've been around for over 100 years, and they're shutting down all their shop fronts. So, and also I read another article that Estee Lauder are going to be shutting some of their, you know, store fronts as well, and even some of their counters, and they're going to be investing more in online shop fronts. And I think the same thing is happening in Australia. And I think Myer and David Jones, which is where a lot of our luxe products are sold, they're cutting down or making much smaller their retail footprint. And I think that's where we will still continue to benefit from e-commerce. So I believe that it's going to continue. It won't grow at the same level that it's grown during COVID, but certainly I think we've become far more digitized as a nation. I think we've become a lot more comfortable with giving security information, credit card information online, and we're more comfortable in that environment. And I anticipate that it will continue, absolutely.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to get that mix right of kicking the economy off in these better ways of consuming, but also making sure, I guess, we retrain and find job opportunities for all the retail staff that have been displaced. So really interesting opportunity, I guess, for education and training and people trying new things in their own lives, let alone in our businesses.
Got to keep reinventing. Got to keep reinventing yourself.
Yeah.
No, every 7 years, I reckon. So 7-year itch, you've got to reinvent yourself.
Fantastic. All right. Just to wrap up really quickly, 1 sentence, 2 sentences. I know you probably all had this within what you've covered, but just to wrap up, what are you most excited about in the next 12 months? What's really, I guess, what either itch you want to scratch or what's that you've seen so far that's making you most excited? Rose, what are you most excited about? Having a holiday at some point in Australia Post? Just
being outside of my postcode would be great.
Yes, I'm looking for your postcode to see where you rank in terms of your online shopping behavior. I would love to go travel. Love to go and see Spain, or if it ever looks the same again. Right, I'm really excited around what brands are doing at the moment, actually. So some of the things that Lyndall was talking about, how brands are evolving and bringing the experience to the online world. I think that's pretty exciting, and that's certainly is something will raise the bar in us being in the e-commerce space for quite some time. And certainly from a convenience and point of view, that will be a very great experience for a lot of shoppers. And being a shopper myself and an online adopter, love to see that happening. Fantastic.
Erik, what are you most excited about?
I think one of the things that really excite me over the period we have ahead of ourselves is before we went in around the world into lockdown, there were a significant amount of brands and industries who were saying that it is impossible for us to work remotely. And guess what? The world moves on. We're all doing a pretty good job. And I look forward to a bit of normality coming in, and maybe offices and being among your peers being... let's call it a thing that you do every now and then. And the brands finally accept that we can work from anywhere. We can deliver results from anywhere. And all we really need to do is make sure that we have good ways of working. So I look forward to the new working culture, if I'm honest, at the end of this, when we are able to leave our postcodes, because my postcode is pretty boring, I'll be honest with you. But at the same time, I'm looking forward to brands and businesses evaluating what the future looks like. What does a future workplace look like? What do we expect from employees? And how do brands work together? I think co-location and being in the same room, and it's critical and so on, that's been the mantra for a long time. And I'm excited for society to sort of discover that it's not really true everywhere. I'm excited for that.
Cool. Ryan, what are you excited about? 1 sentence.
1 sentence.
Come on.
Shaking someone's hand and giving them a hug and being human again.
Yeah. Yep.
Making cash famous, having cash being discovered by millions more people, and just continuing to grow the brand.
That's great. You're a lucky marketer having brand dollars at the moment, so make the most of it. Yeah. Lyndall, what are you most excited about?
What I'm most excited about is getting back into the office, because I feel like I'm in a vacuum, right? No, but what I'm really excited about is L'Oreal is really a beauty and a tech company. And we are launching, as we speak, and have got already a number of what we call VTO apps, which are virtual try-on. And so this is all on our websites, so that people can then match up their hair color, decide what eye makeup or what lipstick and things like that, or do diagnostics in terms of skin of your face and skincare that you need. So I'm really excited about the future of VTO within L'Oreal.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you all for that. Next week, we have our webinar on creative. So we're going to dig into some fantastic best of class digital creative, as well as what makes it work. So we'll be hearing from Blackmore's, from Elastic Studios, who develop a lot of creative, Hogarth from a data-driven creative point of view, as well as our analytical friends at Ipsos and Campher, who do the diagnostic work to see what works. So hopefully you can join us next week for that one as well. But thank you to the panel. It's been a great discussion. There's plenty more to say. We might revisit next year and see if our predictions have come true, and see what colour hair Lyndall has at that point.
Yeah, I want to see that too.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us today.
I've had blue before, but it didn't last well.
Nice
Thanks
one.
for having us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.